I don't think many of us would put 2020 down as a year of good fortune and luck, although looking at the heavens at the moment we were expecting massive downpours. It's still being quite fortunate to us, the weather. Shaun Leonard, what kind of impact, I've got to ask, what kind of impact COVID-19 has had on the Wild Trout Trust? I followed some of the misadventures online. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more.
Yeah, so it hit, Matthew, at the very end of our financial year. So in March and April, we laid staff off on furlough for the month of April, May, June, some people into July. So 7 of my colleagues we put on furlough, which basically we hit a point that we simply couldn't do the work that we ordinarily do. We couldn't get out on the ground to do the work. So as a consequence, I laid off most of the conservation officers for that period of time.
Very difficult. I mean, you personally have put, it's not just a job, is it? It's a passion. It must be very
No,
difficult.
and it's effectively a family business. It is absolutely our lives. So it was an extraordinarily difficult time. I mean, only us. Same for lots and lots of other businesses around the country.
What about the recovery from COVID in terms of staffing? Everybody back now?
Yeah, so we had loads of projects to do, and those projects still are there to be done. So I'm actually very bullish about the future going forward. I think things look really good for us as far as one can see, because we have got those projects, we've got new projects coming in, and yeah, people are back up and running.
Can you, we'll talk about the projects and where the Wild Trout Trust is in just a second, but can you sort of, I mean, they talk about the economy that, that we've had, 5 months of it so far of the disease, but the impact could last 2-3 years and more. Have you got any idea about how much of a delay or deferment COVID has caused? Is it just the months that people have been off work, or is it going to have a longer impact?
No, I think we're still seeing some of it. We may speak later about work in Ireland. We've got a lot of work to be done in Ireland, but we can't go there, except that we isolate, and then staff isolate when they come back. So yeah, it's going to run and run, and we don't quite know what's coming this autumn, of course, and the winter. Okay,
well, we'll look at staffing, because there's been quite a lot of comings and goings in a while. Let's first of all, though, talk about projects. Any particular projects that have been delayed, that are now sort of top priorities as we come out of lockdown?
So we've got a lot of work, for example, in the north, on the rivers Ayr, Nid, Wharfe, which, as we start to pick up momentum, they'll be really top priority projects that Johnny Gray is working with the Environment Agency and with Yorkshire Water up there. Those are some really good ones that we can be doing. There's some good work to be done in Somerset, really nice projects to be done down here on Chalk Stream land. So yeah, there's projects all over the place that we can be getting on with.
Are there any pluses with regard to sort of the impact of COVID on people and on industry that will ultimately benefit rivers and wildlife?
Well, I think during lockdown we did see a really interesting period where, during the complete lockdown, where rivers were left utterly alone, and maybe you noticed it too, but wildlife seemed to flourish from no traffic, no airplanes, and that felt a really nice thing for a recovery of nature.
I live right in the middle of London, Camden. I'm seeing tiger moths. I haven't seen that. I mean, I've never seen them in central London. I've seen my first sparrow in my garden. I've been there 20 years, so I know they're around. So yes, there has been a return.
Yeah, incredible. We've got flocks of goldfinches I've never seen before this year. But it was interesting once people were let off the leash a little bit, how that impacted on the rivers. And we've seen that here, for example, on the Itchen. We've seen crowds of people coming down to the river, places where they're not actually meant to be at all.
People talk about new normals. I'm rather cynical. I'm not entirely sure human behaviour changes that quickly. Are you optimistic? Not so much?
No, I'm perennially optimistic. Yeah, definitely optimistic. Yeah.
What about, we can't ignore it. I mean, we're sitting here middle of August, coming up to the middle of August, unprecedented heat wave. I've just seen it's way hotter than 1976, sustained tropical temperatures. I was hearing of, I think, the River Usk over 21 degrees, the Itchen here nudging 20 degrees.
Yeah.
It's not good for our rivers, these kind of temperatures, are they?
No, definitely not good. I mean, you can look at some of the scientific data that shows the impacts of climate change, of global warming. And the Itchen is a much studied river in exactly that example. And you can see both winter temperatures and summer temperatures, which are within a few decades are going to be hitting temperatures that are extremely uncomfortable for both salmon and trout.
Well, going off the message just a little bit, I'm interested. The first I was aware of the soaring temperatures in our waters was I think it was a Gwent Angling Association decided to pull, they cancelled fishing.
Yeah.
I know other angling clubs have been doing the same. Do we need to maybe look at something, maybe even legislation to ensure that people don't go fishing when the water is too hot?
Well, there are guidelines for that, certainly in the salmon world, perhaps less so in the trout world.
Yeah.
But again, here, sticking to the itchin, the fishery at the bottom end of the river is not fishing today because the river's tipped over 20 degrees. Now that's a good thing, and in terms of fish welfare, we know that, again, particularly salmon, but also trout, they start to struggle in those upper teens.
Let's talk a little bit about practical projects, because again, I mean, I've seen people like Johnny Gray seem to be busy all the time, but
Yeah.
I'm imagining that there's been several months where things have been put on hold. Talk us through some of the projects you're doing, maybe the Dorset Stour first of all.
Yeah, so I mean, if I were reviewing the year that passed, so that 1920 year, we did a really interesting project down with the Wimborne Angling Club on the Dorset Stour, which was actually as much about coarsefish as it was about trout. But it was the installation or bunging woody debris into the river to create complex habitat. It was about creating fry bays with machines digging out scallops in the bank edge that would create calm, slack water that's great primarily for coarse fish, but it might be that baby trout go in there too. That was a really nice project. We did a really good one again down south in November of last year in partnership with the local Environment Agency, with the landowner and his river keeper, and with the Wessex Rivers Trust, who led it, taking weirs out of about 2 kilometres of the upper test, putting loads of massive woody debris into the river and hundreds of tonnes of gravel. And that's been a real success, that project.
Now, I know a little bit about why that works. I'm rather hoping that through today's programme that we're going to reach a broader audience. Why would you want to chuck wood in a lovely clean river?
It's just about creating that complex habitat, just making things nice and varied. So we broadly know what the habitat requirements are at various stages of the life cycle. So if we put wood in there, it pushes the water around, it scours out holes, it gives the fish places to hide. It's also fantastic for invertebrate life that the fish will end up feeding on. And in many places it's actually quite a common resource. You know, it's cheap, it's on site, it's easy to use.
I've been talking to the river keeper here on this bit of the Itchen, and you first turn up and I know a little about how these are sort of man-made streams out of swamps and such like, but I had no idea that beneath the surface all kinds of man-made obstacles have been put in to improve the flow, to improve the habitat, not just for fish though.
Yeah, not just for fish, exactly that. And
That's
just
good.
push it around. So you're using the force of the water to create shapes on the bed of the river, scour out holes.
Now I've got a note here, this relates to the northern rivers. I know on the Aire, the Nid and the Wharf, looking at improved fencing. Hinged trees, what are hinged trees?
Yeah, so it's the idea that you're going to put something, again, that woody debris into the river, but rather than trying to secure it and risk it being washed away in those floods, you simply cut through a tree, fold it over into the river, so it's still living, it's still attached to its stump, and hopefully it's attached strong enough that it won't get ripped out by the next flood, and it can work in the river doing the good stuff that it will do.
That's fantastic.
Very simple as well, very simple.
You mentioned as lockdown has eased, lots and lots of people that we wouldn't necessarily normally see on the sides of our rivers and lakes turning up and having a good time. And I appreciate we have to share our waterways. I was fishing on the Dart in Devon just a few weeks ago, and I met one of the local sort of bigwigs in an angling club there. I'll leave his name out of it. And he was talking about the problem he'd had with canoeists. And he was railing, I hope this isn't too often, he was railing about the fact he felt the canoeists, through virtue of good PR and government funding actually coming through various circuitous routes, were getting the upper hand, and we had quite a long discussion. I was trying to argue we have to find a way to allow everybody to access the rivers, and it's just from you talking about the extra numbers that have been turning up to swim and to enjoy our waterways, whether you foresee more problems, more politics, or whether there is a way to ensure everybody gets a fair crack of the whip, a fair access.
Yeah, you'd like to think the latter, and you'd like to think as well, for the benefit of the river and the conservation of the river, that it's really important to bring all of those disparate groups together.
Yes.
Whether it's people fighting against sewage pollution, whether it's people, canoeists, rowers, anglers, because we as an angling constituency are not big and we're not incredibly powerful, but some of those other ones are much more powerful. So as a unified force, we could be something interesting indeed.
So that's something we're going to reach out, open arms and bring people in? At the moment, it just struck me that everyone's pushing at each other rather
Yeah,
than
I think
pulling
that's
together.
right. But I would like to think that one of the strengths of the Wild Trout Trust is that we're good at partnership and collaboration, not at conflict and polarisation.
Good. Glad to hear it.
Yeah.
Do you think that the behavioural change we've seen in people, is it just a reaction to being in lockdown, or do you think we're going to see new faces regularly in our rivers and waterways?
Well, we've seen an incredible upsurge in rod licence sales, if we're sticking just to angling, which has been mirrored elsewhere in Europe, incidentally, on the back of post-COVID. And so that would be fantastic if those people stick with angling, if they, on the back of angling, acquire an interest in rivers, in conservation of rivers, and doing things right. I guess what I'd like to think is the sort of WTT philosophy on stuff.
Okay. Let's, you mentioned about furloughing, and it's great to hear that everybody's sort of back on board and working as normal. There have been quite a few, it's been a bit of a revolving door, some well-known faces have left and some new arrivals as well.
Yeah, so I suppose the sadnesses of the past year was that we lost Malcolm Greenhalgh as a vice president. We lost David Bellamy as a vice president. Malcolm Greenhalgh particularly was an incredibly strong force for wild trout conservation and in salmon conservation as well. He was a big hole. We had a couple of trustees step down. Edward Twiddy, who's been with the Wild Trout Trust since its very earliest days, done pretty much every role in the Wild Trout Trust in a voluntary capacity, was chairman of trustees, has now stepped down to join you in the ranks of the vice presidents, and is already doing a fantastic job. We lost Alan Kettle-White from the board of trustees, who's the biologist in Scotland in Argyll on Loch Awe. But we gained a couple of fabulous trustees as their subs, which has been brilliant. And amongst the staff, we lost Mike Blackmore, who's gone to the Wessex Rivers Trust, with whom we are working still incredibly closely. But he was a big loss for us. He's our first full-fledged conservation officer that's left in my decade, and I felt I lost it. His loss was a big loss. I
have to say, I did think it's such a sort of sympathetic role he's gone into.
Yeah, totally.
I saw it as a sort of, broadly speaking, a good thing that the tentacles are reaching out.
It's great. And of course he's been replaced by Nick Lawrence, who's already proving his worth. Fantastic. This is Nick's first year with us. His anniversary was yesterday. And Bruno Vincent joined in September. So yeah, we're delighted to have Bruno, who of course is arranging this day of our virtual get-together.
And just finally, I mean, it's only just gone past the middle of 2020, but I know I'm already thinking about 2021. What do you see the next 12 months as? I was going to ask you a true and steady path. I don't think anybody can make that claim, can they?
No, they can't. No, I think the one thing that's a very important point, and I meant to bring this up earlier on. I needed to thank the staff for the period of furlough, because that was incredibly stressful for a lot of people. But we've also, as an organisation, we've got a fantastic board of trustees behind us, and those guys really stepped up to the plate during COVID, and I think they've put us onto a financial footing which is about as good as we could possibly have hoped. So at least the horizon that one can see, which is sometime the end of this year and into early next year, we're in a good place.
Great to hear. Shaun, lovely.